Hello and welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas for the Am The Cavalry track this evening. Today we have Jen Ellis of Rapid 7 and Josh Corman of Politics World. And I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember, sorry. And hopefully we'll have Jay Radcliffe joining us from Rapid 7 too. These talks are being recorded, so if you have a question, if we have time for questions at the end, if you can raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone over to you. And please silent your cell phones. And then last of all, of course, we need to thank our sponsors, Verisprite, Protivity, Tenable, Amazon, and Source of Knowledge are all our stellar level sponsors this year. So let's give them a hand and welcome Josh and Jen.
All right. Thank you for being patient. What a great day. Everybody have a good time today? A lot of good content. So we're going to have 2 back-to-back sessions on healthcare. It's one of the biggest concern areas. It's a sixth of our economy. It's one of our most exposed issues. And in the Cavalry, we like to talk about that sometimes we're allergic to catchphrases, but catchphrases stick, especially with multiple stakeholder groups. So we talk about wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. And if you think about all the areas that could entail, vehicles, trains, airplanes, industrial control systems, smart cities, industrial IoT, the one that keeps me up at night the most is healthcare. Partly because there is zero learning curve required to hack Windows XP on unsegmented networks directly reachable from Shodan or from the internet. So this exposes us to a bevy of accidents and adversaries that don't require much talent. So Bo likes to say malicious intent is not a prerequisite to harm. And this was a talking point for a few years as we tried to prepare for a more resilient and trustworthy healthcare. But now it's a reality with things like WannaCry. WannaCry was not intending to take out hospitals, and thank God it had that kill switch in it, and thank God it didn't do as much damage as it could have. And I'll show you some data science from Bob Rudis at Rapid 7 as well as to how bad it could have been. But that was not intending to hurt hospitals, and yet without that intention, it did really serious harm. And you might have heard, if you were here for Jessica's panel earlier, when Congress asked for a healthcare cybersecurity task force for 1 year, they did not know that 2016 was going to be the biggest year in ransomware and healthcare in history. In fact, for the longest time, it had enjoyed relative obscurity as an industry. In fact, that was well before even Hollywood Presbyterians attack. So I'm going to show a few slides that we showed in CyberMed Summit. The general flow of this particular chunk 1 of our 2, is I'm going to show a little bit about why I think healthcare cybersecurity is in critical condition. And not to wallow in the problem or admire it, but maybe it sparks something in you where you have an idea of how to make it better. Or maybe it drives you to get involved, or maybe you can do some sort of donation of your time to mentor someone in technology services at a hospital in your region, or just get more involved and amplify the good work that others are doing. But in this one, we're going to talk a little bit about why healthcare cybersecurity is in critical condition. We also want to highlight the kind of coordinated vulnerability disclosure that focuses first and foremost on patient safety, with an anecdote for how Jay Radcliffe in Rapid 7 worked collaboratively with Johnson & Johnson and the FDA to make sure the right things happen in the right sequence, to prioritize patient care over all other motives. We really want to applaud and amplify what we consider to be what we want to see is the default behavior. And number 3, time permitting, and I think we'll have some because we booked it, they couldn't be here, but the 2 physicians that did a magical thing with a bunch of us in Phoenix, Arizona, we did the world's first clinical hacking simulations and tabletop exercises to see how prepared hospitals really are and physicians really are. And it was amazing. So I hope to show some raw footage from some of that you wouldn't have seen on ABC. Pretty decent piece, 9-minute piece on ABC Nightline, but very superficial for how much stuff we did in those 2 days. But I want to give you guys a treat. We're eventually going to make some really nice curated voiceovers of what's happening, the medicine behind it, the hacking behind it. But for now, I want to show you guys a treat for being here. So in the third chunk of this, we'll do so. And then in the next hour, especially since we're slicing these up for the video, we have several members of the healthcare task force that are here to answer questions. So a lot of the staging will be done in this session, and we're probably just going to jump right into talking about that in the next session where we'll do proper introductions. Sound like a good flow? Okay, so I will try to go quickly here. And hey Jay. Excellent. All right, so I'll try to do this in about 15 minutes. I'm not going to do a ton of slides. You saw some this morning if you went to the keynote. So essentially, the thing that really scared me, and I mean really scared me, this is actually, there were two events. I'm going to be a little too transparent here. There were two things that made Bo and I decide to leave the comfort and safety of the private sector and go into bizarre think tank land and public policy land. Policy, not politics. I don't like politics. One of them happened, I'm going to go in reverse order. Hollywood Presbyterian in February of last year got hit by a piece of ransomware called SamSam. And I spent a lot of my private sector career the last couple of years focused on third-party and open source supply chain risk, things like Heartbleed. And this was a deserialization flaw in one Java library, in JBoss, in one medical device. And without intent, without it specifically targeting that hospital, Hollywood Presbyterian shut down its patient care and diverted ambulances. Now, I don't know the last time you were in a hospital, but think of the type of things you do in a hospital, right? You see the birth of your child. Maybe you're worried about, is it going well? Are there complications? You might get hurt, and you might be waiting for emergency care with a whole bunch of sick people in an emergency room for hours and hours. You might be saying goodbye to a friend who's dying. There's a whole bunch of reasons we don't really want to be in hospitals. You should avoid them at all costs. Usually bad things happen there, or sometimes wonderful things. But what you don't want in those really tender moments and those really vulnerable moments is to have some sort of complication or delay. And what we're learning as we start digging into this is degraded or delayed patient care absolutely kills people. People die in hospitals every single day. It's just a part of the emergency medicine. It's part of surgery. People die. The question is how many more people die when there's degraded or delayed care? And can you imagine being in that ambulance and bleeding or needing emergency care and having to go up the street? Maybe it's a couple minutes. This might be as good a place as any to put it in, but our physician friends pointed out a New England Journal of Medicine study on the Boston Marathon. And in this Boston Marathon study, they did a year-over-year comparative analysis of the mortality rates after a certain period of people who had a heart issue that day. And part of the challenge is with the alternative routes for traffic, it added almost 4 minutes extra transit time for the ambulance. And that translated into a statistically significant increase in death. So even though the Boston Marathon's great, especially if you're a runner, there's a cost to that. And it's a cost we don't see in an acute way. It doesn't show up on the news, but there's an increased mortality rate or death rate. So one of the things I should clarify, because some people online got mad from this morning when I mentioned it, the concern is that when WannaCry took out 65 hospitals and 20% of the trusts, is what they call it, in the National Healthcare Service in the UK, that's not one hospital where you have to go up the street. That's a material impact on the total patient care for that country. And to clarify, the trusts in Manchester, UK were not affected, it turned out. But while we were flying to a different medical event, when I saw the Ariana Grande bombings, I got a lump in my stomach and asked, are those systems back online yet? So luckily in that case, they were. But what that means is any sustained denial of patient care on any or all US hospitals will absolutely lead to delayed treatment, delayed surgeries. Maybe they missed something, a test or a scan they could have done. And this is just something we shouldn't be messing around with. It's one of our most important foundational services as a country and as a people, right? When you think of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you get the self-actualization up top, but what's at the bottom? Food, shelter, and safety. And not only is this a mission-critical part of our economy and our GDP, it's also something we desperately need when bad things happen, a hurricane, a natural catastrophe, heaven forbid, a Boston Marathon bombing. So when we did have the task force, I pointed out, because Hollywood Presbyterian had just happened, I flew down to our very first meeting on the same day the Boston Marathon, funny habit, was ending. So everyone on my flight had a Boston Marathon jacket on. And I was brought right back to the time when we ran Source Boston during the bombings. And I asked the room of medical professionals, who remembers the Boston Marathon bombings? And of course, everyone did. And I said, who remembers why the death count was so low? And the average citizen might not know this, but the answer is, it was blocks away from some of the best medical facilities on the planet. And the overall emergency response was impeccable. It's being studied as, in fact, one of the reasons they did it is pre-9/11, they have been testing emergency response services in Boston for a long, long time. So they did a phenomenal job. So one of the things I asked our task force was, what happens if you do a Boston Marathon bombing and a Hollywood Presbyterian denial of service attack? We need these services when we're most vulnerable, and it's just too easy to do it. So the two things that made us decide to leave our jobs was one, when I saw a Hollywood Presbyterian, I showed that even an accident can take out patient care. And then I asked myself, what could Trick do? So some of you know that I researched the rise of Anonymous with Jericho for a few years. And when we did so, we had some custom artwork made. And one of the points we made was that Anonymous as itself wasn't the interesting thing. It was a blueprint that could be copied and perfected by others. And if your FUD radar is going off now, just remember, just because it's scary doesn't mean it isn't true. And we meant that generically. In fact, when we wrote it, there was no such thing as ISIS. We were worried about Al-Qaeda or some other lone wolf or some other extremist group. But it's kind of hard to deny that ISIS has perfected the blueprint and the use of social media for recruiting and propaganda. And more specifically, even though Anonymous globally had very, very few hackers, one of the hacking crews called Team Poison had a hacker named Trick, T-R-I-C-K, Junaid Hussain. And the other thing that scared me is shortly after DEF CON 2 years ago, he was killed in Raqqa, Syria with a drone strike. First hacker ever killed by drone. And I didn't even know he was in Raqqa. We knew in general that he had gone to jail for hacking Tony Blair's website, but at some point after that, he radicalized and started the cyber caliphate. When he was killed, of all members of ISIS, he was the #3 most dangerous man, according to our national security apparatus. So this is a kid who wasn't an elite hacksaw or the best in the world, but he certainly knew how to use Metasploit or Shodan or hack Windows XP or go over SMB, directly expose the internet, which is essentially hospitals. So back to my point about, of all the industries that have safety critical exposure, the first thing I saw with Hollywood Presbyterian is, thank God Trick's dead. The problem is there's not just one of them. He recruited, he trained, there are others, and they can be replicated again. So the two of those things, I said, we've got to lean in harder and faster, and we got to get in front of this. Because if and when someone does a deliberate target on these very soft targets, it'll be like the BP oil spill. It'll be every night on the news. We don't really have the staff training or functions to really separate and segment these things. The blast radius and the fragility is just too high for a bunch of reasons. So I'm going to skip some of this. And then other things happened throughout the last year. Everyone was talking about Mirai as an isolated incident, and we'll never just depend on dying DNS, and we can have other ways to handle this. But if you abstract past the things that actually targeted because they published their source code, all it was looking for was a default username and password combo. You could point it at anything. And one of the things I said with the FDA and some of our HHS colleagues is there's nothing stopping the next Mirai from being comprised of medical devices. Many of these have hard-coded service passwords and are directly facing the internet. And some of these are small, like a bedside infusion pump. Some of them are very large and very expensive multi-million-dollar devices. So some of these clever ideas our friends have, like let's do a white worm to brick all these Mirai botnet nodes, you might be bricking something connected to a human. These are not good ideas. And it's not going to be easy to fix. So some of these, the capital expenditure for some of these things are really high. And if they shouldn't be on the internet in the first place, it takes staff and training to know how to properly segment these things so they can still deliver patient care. So when I looked at Mirai, I didn't look at the current manifestation. I looked at what might happen were this to find its way into not only unpatchable devices in some cases, but devices that you really just can't take offline. You need to use them. So this was a pretty scary thing. And then BrickerBot didn't do much and make many headlines, but BrickerBot was not using this to turn it into a botnet or to send DDoS traffic or to ransom anything. It would find its node and it would destroy it. So think of destructive malware on safety critical systems. So without cursing, one of the things I used to say was you should focus on known vulnerabilities first. I call this H.D. Moore's law. I said the power of a unskilled adversary grows at the rate of the Metasploit project. So I said a known vulnerability is much more likely to be exploited, and data scientist Michael Reutman proved that it's about 30 times more likely to be exploited once one's known in some combination of Metasploit or exploit DB. But now I say something even more basic, which is get your SOS, right? Get your stuff off of Shodan, right? Because if you're nakedly reachable from any internet noise, this is the kind of thing that might lead to harm. Well, within a couple weeks of us trying to publish our IATC task force report, WannaCry did just that. You know, an undirected mass infector, probably the largest aggressive worm that we've seen since Zotab, right? A long time. A lot of people think we beat the worms. We never beat them. They just got their motives shifted to profit and more discrete targets and avoiding provocation of response. So with WannaCry, it was taken out pretty quickly through the heroism and luck of one researcher who found one clever flaw in its kill switch and whatnot. But 65 hospitals is a lot. We got very, very lucky. And to their credit, HHS spun up a bunch of responses and phone calls and pulled together the best and brightest and to gather actual information. And it was a good fire drill for us to see if our house is in order. But we have a lot more to do. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. But just to show you how lucky we were, that big orange block this is from Bob Rudis at Rapid7. He scoured the internet safely, not irresponsibly, to find SMB exposure. The US had 330,000 exposed nodes. Now, they're not all hospitals, but a lot of those are hospitals and academia. And if that research is lost, it's lost forever in academia. They're really bad at backups. Now, even though the US by far had the most exposure globally per country, relatively unscathed. We had some hits, but relatively unscathed. We got very, very lucky. And I'd like to tell you when he keeps measuring this week after week, I should have asked him today, but we weren't shrinking very fast. So even though we got lucky, we didn't act like we got lucky. So part of the issue is we just don't have the staff. So I'm going to end for this section before we bring up Jen and Jay. Jay and Jay, hey, isn't that funny? Jen and Jay? Okay. There's a lot in the task force, and we're going to talk about it in the next hour. But we settled on a pretty aggressive first graphic, and Nue, if she's still in the room, helped us make this with Doug. But we said healthcare cybersecurity is in critical condition. If you can't read the eye chart, essentially there were about 13 or so unique challenges that we thought faced modern healthcare. But I'm going to paraphrase the top 5. Severe lack of security talent in clinical healthcare. Part of the issue is a highly fragmented and privatized and geographically dispersed health delivery strategy in the US, just given how big the country is. There's statistics every year that we do know about how large these are. So you have large, medium, small, and rural. The overwhelming majority fall in the last 2 categories of 20 or fewer employees or 10 or fewer employees. And you know 0 of those are even an IT person. The larger hospitals have staffs. But without a census, which we'd like to see, you know, a decent estimate based on other factors is about 85% of our health delivery organizations lack a single qualified security person. When we talked to some of the ones that were considered leaders in their space in rural, it was essentially a nurse that was also doing the QuickBooks and also had watched some SANS classes online, SANS storm bites and things online, and were begging us for, can we get a 3-day crash course on a CISSP or something like that? And they were begging, and they're doing the best that they can, not judging these organizations. And they're on such razor-thin margins that there's no way they can afford one under the current cost structures. But if 85% have 0 people defending them, and we're sitting ducks for these things. You know, I made a joke to Bo. I said, we make fun of security by obscurity. It's a punchline, right? We make fun of it. But then I sadly asked, what if that's all we have? And unfortunately, Hollywood Presbyterian rang the dinner bell, and a lot of hackers started deliberately targeting ransomware against hospitals to the point where it became the top target of ransomware last year. So number one, there's almost nobody minding the till. So who's going to set up the firewall rule? Who's going to do the patch? Who's going to receive the InfraGuard or FBI alert? Who's going to know what to do with it if they got it? This is a clear and present danger. I don't think that's an overstatement. We've been lucky, but that obscurity is over. Number 2 is legacy equipment. Just a reality of the cadence of IT in these systems, both office systems and medical devices through FDA or EHRs through a different part of it, HHS. A lot of these things are running Windows XP as a best case. And the time to live in the field is very long. We must have gone down the rabbit hole in this for 7 months on how wicked a problem it is to drain the swamp of legacy technology. Not only is XP past its end of life, its successor, Vista, has been end of life. And we really don't have a robust way to fix this. And we don't want to throw away otherwise excellent medical technology. But from a security perspective, this is essentially like doing surgery without washing our hands first. So just like we have physical hygiene, we do need some level of cyber hygiene woven into the cost of delivering connected medicine. Number 3, I say this with love because it was the road to hell sometimes is paved with the best of intentions, but HIPAA introduced, HIPAA and HITECH introduced meaningful use, which tied reimbursement for medical technology to the ability to receive and transmit electronic health records. And this drove a level of premature connectivity and over-connectivity. And this is one of the contributors to why a single flaw on a single device has a blast radius of taking out an entire facility, because it's incredibly hard for these brittle, poorly interoperable systems to be segmented or isolated without really knowing what you're doing and having qualified staff, which we don't have. So this is over-connected to each other and to the outside world. And number 4, because of that blast radius, a single flaw on a single device can affect patient care. As we saw with Hollywood Presbyterian initially, 4 UK hospitals in November, another 4 in January, and then 85 in a single day with WannaCry. Lots of good news here, right? And then to kick it, while this is a specific example for a vendor who will be here on the panel, and actually the story behind this is quite impressive, and I hope we get a chance to tell it. But Billy Rios and some others found a single device had 1,400 or more CVEs in it. And when you looked at it, it wasn't a medical device per se, but it was in the clinical environment. It was past end of life. You could come up with a bunch of reasons. But the bottom line is when you look at any particular piece of medical technology, it's not uncommon to see over 1,000 CVEs in there. Doesn't mean they're all exploitable, but as we know, it takes one. So let me tie this back together. Maybe 85% of our healthcare delivery organizations don't have a single qualified security person on staff. They probably need a lot more than one. They're trying to defend harder to defend things than we do in banks, which are more modern and better kept up to date. They're over-connected to each other and reachable from the outside world. A single flaw in a single device can take out patient care. And the average device gives you 1,000 chances to do so. I'd say we've got some work to do. Now, the good news is we put a ton of heart and thought and work into that task force report. And we've come up with some pretty bold ideas of how to turn the tide. It's just going to take political will, a lot of public support, and in some cases, a lot of time. So that's why I said this morning, time is the enemy. Now, we have some very positive news in the form of, how do you solve world hunger by eating a sandwich, so to speak, of some really positive trends, building on the great work Suzanne and her team have done to really hack the incentives and reframe the posture of cybersecurity for these medical device manufacturers, not one at a time. And this is something I'll take an aside. During our kickoff, I said to the room 4 years ago, I said, I have no interest in finding and fixing one flaw in one device from one manufacturer. We want to hack the industry. We want to fix the incentives with which these are done. There are thousands of vendors. There will be thousands more. We have to think bigger, and we have to think like hackers. So we have class breaks. I want to see class fixes. And it's Suzanne's courage and her team have helped us look at the heart of the hydra, not the heads of the hydra. The root causes, not the symptoms. And I think we've got the medical devices put on a path. Sadly, it takes 6 years or so for those that go through R&D and clinical trials and pre-market approval. So we won't see the fruits of that for some time, but I think that's on a good path. Now we want to shift our attention to the clinical exposures that we have. And while we did this for US focus, it's a global supply chain, and many of these issues are equally shared by our allies elsewhere. There's a few unique benefits and challenges in other countries. But at this point, I'm going to pause. We're going to show a success story of how putting patient safety first allows for the best and brightest of our research community to work with the best and brightest manufacturers trying to do the right thing. And Jen, please come up. Round of applause for Jen and Jay.
Technology works. Yes, except my Mac's a new Mac.
While she's setting up, we can distract. Did someone have a comment, I thought, up front?
Good question. About the legacy devices. They're very expensive, lots of money, and the hospitals are complaining they have a thin margin. I'm saying that as I worked as a pediatric ICU nurse for many, many years. So you come out with the new and brightest things, and I'll tell you that I use 20-year-old pumps sometimes. So you come out with the new and bright and shiny stuff. How do you get them to convert over when they can't afford to get new, bright, and shiny as it is?
I promise I will answer that during the HHS task force panel. We went really down the rabbit hole on that one, including a cash for clunkers and some procurement guides for new devices. But I'm going to hand to Jen for right now.
Thank you. And thank you very much for helping out. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Jen Ellis. I'm InfoSec Jen. I'm at Rapid7. Apparently, as of this morning, I am officially Josh Corman's hero. That's me. Some familiar faces in here. It says it's on. It's on. It's just not close enough to my mouth. I don't know how we're going to fix that. Is this better? I could just speak like this. It's super comfortable. Do you like it? Up there? Really? All right. I mean, I could pin it to my lip. It would be awkward, but I could try and make it like nostril. Is this like you can't know? It's still not on. You do have a very loud voice, but it's not working. Oh, I know. How about the unicorn? Can we make this work? Is it going to be weird? It's always weird. It's not necessarily bad when it's weird. No, it doesn't work. All right. How about one of these boys?
Grab it.
Some kind of problem solving going on here. Oh, lovely. Hello. Now I feel like I'm going to break into song, which nobody wants, trust me. Okay, so yes, I am here to talk about the Johnson & Johnson Animus one-touch ping disclosure. But really what I'm here to do is talk about my love for Colin Morgan and Jay Radcliffe. Thank you, yeah. Apparently it's been a day of talking about heroes. I love you too. Okay, so basically what happened was, I believe that a year ago, Colin was here. Not here, he was downstairs. And he was talking as part of the cavalry track, and he was talking about his journey at J&J, where he had basically had this epiphany of cyber safety issues in medical devices, and had decided that he would frankly take on the Herculean challenge of changing the culture at Johnson & Johnson so that he could build a vulnerability receiving and handling process, which is just an amazing thing for a person to decide to do and then actually achieve. And so the thing that you didn't know was that while he was talking to you about that, we were working with him on a vulnerability disclosure. And in fact, what happened was after 2 years of Colin rolling this incredibly large, cumbersome rock up a hill, he had got to the point where Johnson & Johnson had agreed to a vulnerability disclosure program, which he was building. And a week before he announced it, we knocked on his door and said, "Cooey, we've got something to tell you." So this is the story of how that process went, considering that we were a week before he was ready to unveil it, and we were the test case. And just to give you a little bit more context, those many of you may remember that this time last year we were probably 2 or 3 weeks past the MedSec disclosure. Hadn't happened yet? Oh, okay. So, all right. Okay. So my memory's a little dusty. So what happened was we disclosed to them, and then about, I think, a month after we disclosed, MedSec happened, and we were like, oh shit, we don't want to be associated with anything like that. So this is Jay Radcliffe. And what a fine figure of a man he is. This is a shameless plug showing Rapid7 on the Wall Street Journal. This is Jay talking about the disclosure. And the point of this slide, and I'm going to come back to it, is to show how we got to this point. This is the positive outcome for all concerned. And I'm going to talk about how we got there and why it's a positive outcome. So very quickly, and I am not a technologist, and there'll be lots of people who'll throw things at me, particularly Jay, but just very quickly, the way that this works, and for those of you who don't know, which is probably not anyone in this room, but Jay is diabetic. And he has a very personal stake in this kind of research. About 6 years ago, I think, you did the Medtronic research. He researched an insulin pump that was attached to him physically at the time and found some bad things. And so I think since then, since Jay has made the decision to take injections rather than an insulin pump, his doctor has probably urged him a number of times to go back to a pump. And so Jay thought, 6 years have passed, let's have a look and see what the technology is doing today. So he looked at the Animas One Touch Ping. And the way that this device works is there's two pieces to it, as you can see in the shiny picture. There is the insulin pump itself, which connects to you physically, and then there's a remote control which communicates with the pump via radio frequency communication. And the remote control basically will tell the pump when to release insulin. It's a sort of automated process. And so Jay, in the course of his research, discovered that with the right skills and the right technology, you could intercept or spoof those communications to either pause insulin delivery or push a potentially fatal dose. Not the best news, all things considered. So we decided to disclose, which is a thing that we do, and this is often how these things go. It's not always the most popular moment of a researcher's life. And with J&J, we felt like there was the potential for, let's say, a lot of unknowns. We at Rapid7, we do a fair amount of vulnerability research. We probably disclose somewhere between 25 and 50 vulnerabilities a year. So we're not new to this. We're not, completely naive about how the process goes, but every process is a little different and everyone has its own challenges. And with this one, firstly, there was the fact that we were dealing with things that related to life and death. And while Jay had experience of that at another company, we had never done that at Rapid7. Java is serious, but it's not often life and death. And so that was one. The second was that I don't know if you've heard of Johnson & Johnson, but they're quite big. And Rapid7's growing fast and really buy the stock, but we are not on the same level. So that was a little intimidating, and we knew that they'd have big, expensive lawyers, and we knew that they'd need them because often with Johnson & Johnson, when people knock on their door and say, hey, there's a problem in your product, they have all their friends with them, and it's called a class action suit. And so we knew that there was a big chance that they would be at least incredibly cautious and possibly just sick some lawyers on us. So those were some of the things that we were worried about. But the great surprise for me was the first call that we did with them, this voice gets on, and I'm doing what I do, which you can tell is what I do, is I was babbling. And this voice says, is that Jen? And it's Colin. And it turns out like he and I had met actually at a round table that Jessica sitting over there had organized, so thank you for being matchmaker, Jessica. And that gave us a foot up because Colin and I had the experience of meeting each other. We had built some basic level trust. We weren't, besties at this point. We hadn't sworn a blood oath, but we had a little bit of mutual respect, and we kind of understood that we were both in it for the right reasons. And so that gave us an opportunity to kind of hear each other more openly, which was good. Because, typically they're not used to having people say, hey, we've come, we want to help, we want to work through this stuff with you, which is what we do when we do disclosures. So because Colin and I had met, and Colin was aware of Jay and his reputation and his credibility, there was a little foundation there of respect, and I had, and still have, a bucket of respect for Colin for all of the work that he's done at Johnson & Johnson, rolling those big rocks. And so that kind of gave us that nice foundation. So we started working on the process together. And there was a lot of learnings. They're dealing with a highly regulated environment, which meant that we had the sort of specter of the FDA. Hi, FDA. And we had a prior experience. Jay had a prior experience with his previous disclosure of seeing like the reaction that you can have with patients, and we wanted to be very sensitive to that and try not to cause panic for people. And so we were really sort of cautious with how we approached it. And as I said, a month in, MedSec happened. And that was kind of an oh shit moment because, you know, we had a pretty strong example of what we didn't want to do, and we didn't want to cause that level of panic and confusion and upset. So that gave us a good template of where not to go. Along the way, we still found some surprises. So the punchline here is that Johnson & Johnson, once they verified the vulnerabilities, made the decision to proactively notify their patients, which is like a landmark moment. And the landmark moment for me was finding out that people still do that by post. So we then had this like amazing back and forth about what it means to disclose something and when something has become public. And there was a little bit of education, not with Colin, but with Colin's communication team about it's not when the last person gets the letter, hello, have you met the internet? And so that was kind of funny. And there were lots of like very late night phone calls with Colin and I, where I was basically just sharing my vast knowledge of profanity with him, and he was very calmly taking it and hoping that I wouldn't do this with his comms and legal team. And again, this is like a testament to the trust that we built. Like, trust will get you so freaking far, and the only way to build that trust is really to come at it with an atmosphere of openness and honesty and like really a desire to get to the right outcome. And that was our guiding principle for us, is to go back to our little kitty friend here, who for some reason just makes me laugh. Our guiding principle throughout it was we didn't want to freak the patients out, because we knew that the worst possible thing people could do was like start ripping these things out of their bodies. Like, that would cause harm. And so we wanted to like help people understand what the risk profile looked like here, what the real situation was. We wanted to avoid FUD. And we kept coming back to this guiding principle of what is the best thing for the patients. Because we took that approach, we were able to find great common ground. We were able to work together. We worked together with CERT. We worked together with the FDA. And I am sort of speaking on behalf of Suzanne and Seth here, but they basically said, hey, you guys are working together. You seem to have it. So like, we're happy. So that was great. So because we took this approach, it meant we were able to take control of the message. We were able to communicate in a really productive, helpful, proactive way, a calm, neutral way. And that meant that when the story came out, and, you know, yeah, obviously I was very pleased that Jay was on TV, but I was also super pleased that the story here was that Johnson & Johnson was telling people. Johnson & Johnson was taking control of this message, and it was reassuring their patients and giving them pragmatic advice on what to do. And that was a really positive thing. And in the end, we got really positive feedback. We had patients and parents of patients who reached out to us and said, thank you for taking that approach and for making it clear and for not causing panic. And we were also called an exemplar by the FDA. I've only ever had that word used for me in the bad sense. So Seth, thank you. I appreciate it. So that's how we did it. And if you have questions, here is the obligatory Archer slide.
You're not leaving, right?
No, I'm not leaving. Thank you very much.
Josh, are we doing questions first, or are we doing your next part first?
I don't remember how long the video is. Want to go through the video? Yeah. Okay. And then we will do questions for all of us, so don't forget your questions for Jen. That's one of the reasons that they're both my heroes. Okay, so hopefully this will kick back on. Okay, so raise your hand if you were at the CyberMed Summit in Arizona. Pretty amazing, huh? Let's see. Unplugged it. Definitely plugged in. What?
Oh, yeah, sorry, you're dealing with the jet effect right now. You are welcome.
Let's try that again. One of the first principles we have when we're talking to policymakers about cavalry stuff is all systems fail. Come on. Uh-oh. Maybe we are doing Q&A. She has a newer MacBook than I do. Oh, come on. The demo gods don't like videos either. All right, so I'll start explaining what this is. We met on our very first anniversary at DEF CON in the green room. We met two med students, Christian Dameff and Jeff Tulley, and they were presenting on hacking 911. And we said, "You guys are actual med students?" And I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "You know how to hack?" They said, "Physicians are hackers, they just don't know it." And we kind of put our heads together and said, we really got to do something. Now, it took us too long. We said, let's do a clinical hacking simulation. They explained that doctors train on a regular basis. Do you have an HDMI? I can try the HDMI.
Yeah, we have everything. That doesn't look like it's connected.
So what they explained is doctors train on a regular basis for exotic things they're going to encounter a couple times a year, but not every day, such as pregnant woman comes in and needs a defibrillator. There's 2 heartbeats. So it's not a straightforward case, but they'll train. And the goal is that, into their muscle memory, and perhaps, that'll work. Come on. Perhaps they'll be better trained and conditioned to just take the patient and deal with it appropriately. So what they do with this is they use professional actors. I don't mean from Hollywood, but they use actors who know how to do this role. Most of the staff this is so unfortunate.
I called an oddball and have somebody here in a minute.
Okay. I do have an HDMI,
That's
if you have one.
very HDMI too.
So they'll typically do a simulation with an actor, and it feels very real. It's using real equipment and real medicine behind it, and they'll have like the 2-way mirror, and they'll have cameras, and they'll use this to train each other. So if you got some off hours, you'll do a training simulation. They also have these incredibly lifelike and expensive dummies with different names, like Victoria was the pregnant one. I think it was Victoria. And these dummies, they bleed when you cut into them. They have very similar flesh feel for the scalpels. You do chest compressions, it'll crack the ribs. And they do these to make it as lifelike as possible. In fact, one of our task force members, Mark Jarrett from New York, he said that theirs actually also makes you go talk to a fake family afterwards when you lost their loved one, so that you can get conditioned on how to break bad news. Okay. You want to do it? So what we had this bright idea was, let's do one of these with hacking and see if they can handle it. Because oftentimes when you look at all the various stakeholders in this group, they're not at they're not at the same level of their journey. And we've often heard from doctors that hacking wouldn't matter. We're trained for this. We just respond to the symptoms and treat the patients. And to a certain extent, that's very true. And it's very plausible. What we wanted to do is test that. Not to prove them wrong, but just to see what would happen. So using real simulation protocols they're normally used to, they actually publish these and share them. So they've already written these up so they can be replicated by any other simulation in the country or in the world. We decided to do 2 or 3. We ended up doing 3. Guinea pigs, where a physician would come in and all the nurses and physicians were actually in on it to see, would they notice it was hacked? How would it affect patient care? And what lessons could be learned from this. I fear we may not have a video, but I'll at least still explain it. All right, so we did 3 scenarios. One of them was a car crash came into the ER, and they didn't bother to check, not that they would have, but they didn't check that the car crash was actually caused by an overdose of insulin from a hacked insulin pump. So the longer it took to notice that was a root cause, it affected how they treated this younger patient who was passed out, and I believe they seized, and ultimately they did save the patient with some heroic measures, but it was very jarring to them because they just never crossed their mind for the differential diagnosis. Yay! Okay. Number 2, thank you. Number 2, was the one that scared me the most.
Did they ever check the sugar?
They did, but not immediately. So there's things that we learned in the postmortem. For each of these, we would have a session with the physician afterwards. We'd talk through what happened. They'd ask us questions. We'd ask them questions. It was fantastic. The second scenario was a bedside infusion pump, much like the one that Billy Rios found a flaw in and became the first safety communication in history for purely cybersecurity reasons because it had an unmitigated pathway to harm. And that one scares me the most because it's in every single ER in the world. If you're in a NICU, you'll see several infusion pumps connected to patients. In this particular case, the patient needed calcium blocker administered, and they usually do a heavy push and then a drip over a certain amount of time. This hacked device emptied the entire contents in 1 minute and caused cardiac arrest. In this particular case, the one we picked as the guinea pig was a world-class toxicology specialist and knew exactly what to do in that situation, but didn't realize it was a hacked device, so administered the cure with the similarly compromised device. And we had a really robust conversation afterwards. And she said, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was hacked. If I knew it was hacked, I would have grabbed one from the next room, not knowing that hacking the libraries hacked them all. So then discussions start getting into place of, well, what does a hospital do? Should they do manual, which is slower and fewer patients? Do they buy 2 different manufacturers such that anytime one goes out, they have a backup? Does that double or complicate the training for staff? So really interesting discussions were born out of that one. And that one scares me the most because it's the most pervasive. But the one that played best on television was the third one, and I'm going to show you a clip from that, time permitting. Which is a patient with a defibrillator/pacemaker. So the ability to regulate the heart and administer a shock if things went bad. And this particular hack device, the actor was phenomenal. The device was giving electroshock every minute, and he screamed in agony. And the physicians decided to slowly and carefully treat it. But an interesting thing happens with the heart that I didn't know because I'm not from that world, but essentially it's Russian roulette. If you hit the shock at just the wrong point in the heart rhythm, you cause asystole and they die. So the patient coded. They wheel in the dummy, start doing chest compressions, they're cracking ribs. They resuscitate the patient. Next minute hits, screams again. A couple more cycles, they say, what do we do? And they're trained to put a magnet on the chest because there's a factory default safe mode in the firmware that erases the programming and goes to some healthy rhythm. Didn't work. Well, why? Firmware was altered. So the training failed them, dies again. I think the guy died 4 times before they essentially said, you're gonna have to cut the chest. So they wheel out, they get dressed up, they cut into the chest. And just when you see a sigh of relief, when they cut the lead wires during electroshocks in the surgical field, very dramatic for television, but very based in science. He needs a pacemaker to pace his heart. That's why he has one. So the level and waves of this, every single patient was saved with heroic measures, but none of them noticed it was hacked. Even after we told them they were shocked, they never would have asked for a diagnostic or forensics. They would have moved on to the next patient. Patients die all the time. And the overwhelming majority of the discussion was, we're not trained for this. Now, they're very good at doing differential diagnoses and looking for zebras, as they call them, but let me just try to show you a video before I completely run out of time. Okay. This was an amazing experience. And even though I knew it was happening, because we helped design these things, my blood was pumping the whole time. Oh, come on. Here we go. Can you hear this?
Hi there. This is a 74-year-old male. Started having chest pain approximately 30 minutes ago.
Can you hear?
He does have basically 2 MIs. He also has a 3rd-degree heart block, which he had a pacemaker pace. I'm going to lay you down, so I can move you over.
And we got the set of vitals from the patch, but was the heart rate 20 or 120?
It was, he's paced at 60.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
pace rhythm at 60.
60, okay.
110 over 74.
Okay.
On your count.
1, 2, 3. All right, sir. I'm taking care of it today.
He takes aspirin, Plavix, metoprolol, prolastatin. He has taken this, and we gave him 324 in the field.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. Hi, sir. I'm Dr. Henderson. So I heard a little bit about what's been going on, but just in your own words, what brought you in today? What got you calling in?
I was watching TV at home and I started having these shocking chest pains, and it happens about every minute. And each time it happens, it feels like my chest is going to burst.
This is Jeff Tulley, one of our conspirators.
No, please, Doc. You gotta stop it. I got a heart block, and I got a pacemaker, and a shocker, and I think it keeps shocking me.
Okay, do you know what type of heart block you have?
I don't know, am I gonna die?
We're gonna try and make sure that doesn't happen today, sir. So when did you have the pacemaker put in?
About a year ago.
About a year ago? Okay, and have you had any issues with it since then?
No.
Have you been seeing your cardiologist?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ah!
Okay.
Ah!
Okay, can we get an EKG and call radiology for a chest x-ray as well? Yeah, we can give him, do we have IV access?
Yes, we do.
Okay, can we give him 4 morphine? His pressure looks good.
4 morphine?
Now everyone's in on it except for the physician.
Morphine is in?
And because we didn't want to demoralize them, we did give them hints and nudges along the way.
Deep breath, stay with me. Deep breath. Deep breath. All right. So you have any belly pain?
Ah! Oh, stop that!
Okay, we got some pain medicine on board, but that's not helping. Let's get that EKG up, guys.
Okay. All right. So, do you have any allergies, any medications?
No.
Did you take anything new? Any medications? Any drugs?
No.
Stimulus, cocaine, methamphetamine?
No, none of that. No.
Okay. Okay. All right. And have you had any?
Are you looking at the x-ray?
All right. So it looks like a wide, complex pace rhythm. So it looks normal and it's regular. Thank you so much. Okay, and we're still working on the labs?
Yeah, I mean, obviously no sign of MI right now. I don't know what's causing the chest pain.
Okay, so what we can think now is if we'll wait and see what the troponins said is normal. Okay, so likely it's going to be an issue with your pacer. Who's your cardiologist? Dr. Caligula, okay. So let's try to get Dr. Caligula on the phone so we can talk to her about the patient here.
You feel better with medications? That should help you feel a little bit better.
Ah! God, stop it!
Okay.
Oh, please!
Does the medication help at all?
No.
Okay, so his rhythm is
I'm getting a little
changed.
sleepy here. Hey,
Stay with us.
wake up for a second.
Okay.
So he's dying.
So it looks like
I can't
the
feel
rhythm
pulse right
here.
now. Can't feel
Okay,
pulse.
so he's lost pulses.
Then we need to start
All right.
your arm.
Start chest compression, please. Okay. And right time at which.
Now whenever they go to a procedure, they dim the lights, wheel in the dummy, and they put the actor on mic if necessary. They want the doctors to have to feel the chest cavity crushed, because doing chest compressions isn't just an effort of muscle, you're actually breaking bone.
We need to get a magnet and try and put it in AC for this one.
And the physicians will tell you they don't feel like it's a simulation, they feel like it's real.
Yeah, we need to have a pulse and we start chest compression.
Can we start bagging him, please? Okay, can we draw up some epinephrine?
All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
Let me know when you want this medicine.
This is the second or third time they died.
Wait. We need to get pulses. We need to get pulses back first. And once we get pulses back, then he's came in with chest pain. He has an ICD placed for a 3rd-degree heart block.
Okay.
And that could be, go ahead and continue chest compressions. He has his AICD. It seems to be delivering him shocks every minute. He's been getting shocked in the V-fib, and he's actually gone into asystole. We put the magnet on. The magnet did not work. It did not put him in asynchronous.
The magnet.
Did you really put the magnet on? We really put the magnet on. Right now, we're
That's Christian.
trying to make sure we get around this rhythm. But once we get Ross back, every time he gets shot back to the river.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
All right. He's currently in ventricular fibrillation.
So yes, our whole chest compressions.
Okay.
He's paced again.
All right. Listen, if it keeps going in and out, the only thing you're gonna. All right.
What's the only thing
Cut
to
the
do?
chest and disconnect the leads.
So
The leads are the wires that attach.
Open the chest up and disconnect the leads.
Yeah, I don't know anything else you can do.
Okay, can we get set up for that?
Yeah, I'm working on it.
All right, I'm going to fast forward. They're scrubbing, dressing up.
Okay, does anybody have any questions about what we're doing here?
Doctor remained calm the whole time.
Okay.
Later, he told us how freaked out he was.
Let's do a timeout.
Should we drop some paralytic before it starts? Look at the face rhythm. You can still feel pulse. We're still ventilating.
It's just like cutting the flesh. Bleeds just like it bleeds. Heart's in the same place as it would be. Couldn't find the leads.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm getting the hook. But you can see how traumatic this could be.
Okay, he's probably pounding ICD more like constant pressure.
Okay, so I will cut it there. We did 3 of these. They were powerful, and that was just day 1. On day 2, we did tabletop exercises to show what happens if you were to ransom a single hospital in the city of Phoenix. And then plural. What's that? No. So some of them were very seasoned. We're going to try to post all of these from the 4 angles we have. But we think this kind of magical thing is only possible because of relationships across so many stakeholders I talked about this morning. Hackers don't know all this stuff, don't have the access to this stuff. They don't have access to what we know. We grounded it in reality. It was powerful. So with this, I'm hoping people stay for this. We can do questions for both of them, but let's try to do our transition to get the task force members up here and do the introductions. And sorry we had some AV difficulties, all systems fail. But I think this is one of the best fruits of this multi-stakeholder approach of empathy and trust, and I hope to do more of these. We want to turn this into a 50-state initiative, working with governors to pick which hospitals in which cities. But the tabletops revealed that we are wildly underprepared for even one hospital going out. We're just over-dependent on these undependable things. All right, here you go.
Thank you to Josh Corman and Jen Ellis and